Welcome to Precision Analytical's video series on advanced hormone testing. In this video, we're going to be talking about our dried urine testing for comprehensive hormones, our Dutch testing. We're going to be talking specifically about the androgen portion of the profile. So for the androgens, you can see the hormones that were tested listed here. And then, of course, on this page, we're just showing whether they're within range and the numbers and the ranges. It's hard to tell a lot from that page. I like to look at it more visually. I think you can tell more when you're looking at it within the context of the hormonal cascade. When we're looking at androgens, the first basic question is just how much of these hormones are we making? So for DHEA and androstenedione, we kind of have three markers to look at the production of those. We've got the DHEA sulfate, we've got etiochalanolone, and androsterone. So those three in aggregate give you a good idea of just how much overall DHEA and androstenedione, how much androgen is being made predominantly from the adrenal glands. And then for testosterone, we've of course got testosterone itself, but then it gets metabolized downstream to these two metabolites. And so we can kind of look at those in aggregate. Of course, the testosterone is the most relevant, but as you look at the whole profile, you get a good idea of what's going on with the androgens. There's also some conversion, and I'm, to be honest, not even sure in which direction. I think in both directions, from etiochalanolone and androsterone down to these terminal metabolites. So they're not definitively markers for how much testosterone turnover you have, because some of that can be coming from the upstream adrenals or adrenal androgens, which can be independent of testosterone metabolism. But if we look at the whole picture, we generally get a good idea of what's going on. Now, the one hormone that people want to know a lot about oftentimes, aside from testosterone, is DHT. Now, DHT, you can see DHT listed twice on here. When you say DHT, you mean this blue one over here, 5-alpha DHT. That's the most potent androgen. So we showed on the previous page that we measure DHT, but we don't list it on the graphical page. So there you can see it there. The reason that we don't list it on the graphical page is it's not actually a great marker for its own production, which is a little bit of an odd situation. But what happens is testosterone, which is mostly protein bound, can get into the cells once it's free, and then it gets metabolized to DHT. DHT interacts with the androgen receptor a lot, which is why it's 3 times as potent as testosterone. But DHT doesn't leave the cell much as DHT. That's not happening a lot. It gets deactivated to androstenedione, and that's the form that we measure. That's the form on the graphical page, and that's pretty relevant. Now, that's all 5-alpha reductase metabolism. Alternately, you can get 5-beta reductase metabolism, which makes metabolites that are not androgenic. So the alpha metabolites, think alpha androgenic. So these alpha metabolites of testosterone and androstenedione are actually more androgenic than the parent compound. DHT is more androgenic than testosterone. These beta metabolites are less androgenic than either. They actually have, I think, some anti-androgenic properties. So what we want to look at here is, you can see with this patient, look at this alpha metabolite here is higher than the middle of the range, whereas the beta metabolite is on the lower part of the range. Here, for testosterone, as we go down this way through DHT, you can see that the alpha metabolite is high and the beta metabolite is not. So there is definitely a preference in this direction for alpha with this patient. So you can see that overall index listed at the bottom there of that section, which is going to then point towards high 5-alpha. So what does that mean? That means at the tissue level, the androgens are becoming more androgenic. So when we have women with thinning scalp hair, when we're looking at men in terms of prostate issues, we want to look at this for a preference metabolically. Now, getting back to this gentleman's profile, it's actually a very interesting profile when you look at it in aggregate, in that his DHEAS is low. So this is an advantage of testing in urine with these broader panels, is if you only looked at DHEAS in saliva, in serum, or in urine, you would conclude that this gentleman probably doesn't make much DHEA. But look down here to the downstream metabolites, and you can see that both of these are within the normal range. So he's making a fair amount, but he's not sulfating it very much. Now, with this particular gentleman, it actually makes a lot of sense. What blocks sulfation? One thing that does a very good job of blocking sulfation, and there's good literature support for this, is inflammation. Another thing that inflammation is good at is it upregulates aromatization. So inflammation makes prostaglandins. Prostaglandins are very good upregulators of aromatase, which means your testosterone is going to get turned into estrogens. Look at this gentleman's estrogens. What else does inflammation push? It pushes cortisol. And look at his cortisol. His free cortisol results are a little bit high in the afternoon, very high in the morning. So this gentleman's got high cortisol, high estrogen with low testosterone, high DHEAS with higher DHEA metabolites, the downstream metabolites, which is kind of a pretty good picture of inflammation. So that'd be a good patient to follow up with maybe a CRP or some of these inflammatory markers, and something that if you can address the inflammation, it may actually significantly alter this profile. But if you don't have all of these different metabolites, it's hard to piece all of this together. Here's another example of this where you've got a woman with thinning scalp hair and some other high androgen symptoms, and yet her testosterone is low normal, her DHEAS is low normal. That's all you're going to get on a typical blood or salivary profile. But then again, as we look at DHEA as it goes downstream, look what we have. We've got an elevation here, and this is on the higher side of normal. And then over here, again, you've got elevations. You not only have an elevation, but what else you'll notice is you've got a preference for these alpha metabolites. So what does that mean? That means this woman's got a decent level of androgens, but because of the way her particular metabolism is running, you could really miss this because she's making a lot of DHT at the tissue level, but then she's also got a fair amount of hormone to start with. You just don't see it in this particular patient when you're looking at the traditional markers, but as you expand your picture and look at more markers, you can see that she's actually overproducing her androgens and then pushing down that 5-alpha pathway. So this is a patient where, something like saw palmetto might go in and block that 5-alpha reductase, shift her metabolism a little bit. Maybe she's got some insulin resistance to deal with there. But again, if you don't have the broader picture, it's hard to make sense of all of that. So that kind of shows the utility of this test in terms of why the expansiveness of the panel is really helpful in a lot of cases. Now, there's one other test on here that some of you might see and not be familiar with, and that's epitestosterone. So there are two reasons we test epitestosterone. It's not androgenic, but in most people, look at this is the male reference range. 28 to 74. For testosterone, it's 27 to 74. So that tells you epitestosterone and testosterone are typically in the same general range. So there are two reasons why they could be dramatically different that we want to look out for. One is supplementation. So this ratio between these two hormones is used in doping testing. So if you're in the Olympics and your testosterone is 10 times higher than your epitestosterone, then you've got a problem. That means you're probably taking exogenous testosterone. So there's some usefulness there in HRT monitoring. The other thing, the reason that we use it is for an internal kind of quality control check for the following reason, and this is a little bit complex. But if you look at this patient, the testosterone is low. Okay, beta androstenediol is low, and DHT is below range. So those three are below range. Well, it just so happens that those three hormones are conjugated by the same enzyme. And there is actually a defect in this enzyme that I believe this patient has that makes the testosterone actually potentially a false low on this patient. So you can see the epitestosterone is in the high end of the range and testosterone is well below range. So if you look at the structures, they look pretty much the same. They're the same molecular weight, epitestosterone. The difference is here. And it makes a big difference in terms of androgenicity. The epitestosterone is not androgenic. But thankfully, they are conjugated. So if we look at this is testosterone-Glucuronide. So this is the form you find in urine. So it's the same testosterone molecule with essentially this sugar molecule put on it. Well, there's an enzyme that's responsible for that, and that's the form we measure in urine. And for the most part, for urine testing, this is very reliable. It's not problematic. But there's this really long named enzyme that has a genetic defect. And if it has a genetic defect, you cannot make this conjugate, even if you have enough testosterone. So what you end up with is all of the compounds that are conjugated by this enzyme, which is again testosterone, 5-alpha DHT, and 5-beta androstenediol. Those are all going to be low even if you have plenty of hormones. So we have some internal checks that look for ratios of these, and we'll let providers know when this pattern is potentially there, because what you have is a situation where you should probably confirm with, I would suggest, a total and a free testosterone in blood to confirm what's going on with the testosterone. It's really rare. We've seen it maybe 2 or 3 times in a couple of years, so it doesn't happen very often. It happens to be more prevalent in people of Asian descent, so something to keep in mind. This particular gentleman's results here is actually of Asian descent, which is why we ask that question on the requisition form. And again, when we see the pattern, we'll alert you, but that's what that is there for, to make sure that we can have confidence in those results, because urine testing always assumes proper phase 2 metabolism, and when that doesn't happen because of a genetic defect, which is, again, it's pretty rare. There aren't a lot of known cases of that, but this is one instance, and so that's why we've added all these other metabolites so that we can pick up this pattern when it happens. So the other reason that we use it is because, again, with supplementation, here's a man with his testosterone. See how high his testosterone is? 254. And his testosterone, epitestosterone, is way below, or not way below range, but it's below range. So if you look at this gentleman, testosterone 53, epitestosterone 5. In these cases, these men are all supplementing. So it's a real rough approximate, but I like to think of the epitestosterone as a potential baseline value for these gentlemen, to say, okay, this guy was probably low for testosterone, and presumably there's a baseline value anyways on testosterone, but you can see he's getting a lot of exogenous testosterone. See, this guy's testosterone ratio is about 10-1. So if he was trying out for the Olympics, he'd be kicked off the team for supplementing. So this gentleman here, again, 10-1, that's problematic. Now, it's problematic if you're trying to get in the Olympics. If you're a man taking HRT or a provider with someone on HRT, you can actually use this to your advantage. Now, look at this last gentleman. His testosterone is low normal, but look at his epitestosterone. If we think of that as sort of a pseudo baseline, I look at that and think, okay, he's probably getting some testosterone from his exogenous testosterone, but he's sure not very high up into the range. Now, if his epitestosterone was up around 30 as well as his testosterone is, then I might look at that a little bit differently and think, whatever we're doing supplementation-wise, it's really not affecting his hormone levels much at all. Now, the relationship between testosterone and epitestosterone as a baseline in terms of that 1-to-1 ratio, it's not quite as rock solid as I would have hoped going into this, so it's a real rough approximate, but one, we're using it to look for that defect, so it's important for us to have it, and two, sometimes with supplementation, it gives you a little better feel for what's going on, so that can be helpful sometimes. So I hope that's been helpful as we introduce this testing model and this expansive androgen panel. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to reach out to us at info@precisionhormones.com, and do see some of our other videos on various topics there on the website at precisionhormones.com.